show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Good evening, I'm Olivia Guthrie in the GB newsroom. Ukraine's president has compared the Russian invasion of his country with Nazi Germany's final solution to exterminate the Jews. A warning, the video we're about to show you contains flashing images. Hundreds of anti-war protesters gathered outside Israel's Knesset as Volodymyr Zelensky's video address was broadcast to Parliament. He questioned the country's reluctance to sell its missile defence system to help Ukraine and asked why heavy sanctions haven't been imposed against Russia. He told lawmakers that Israel will have to live with its choices. Meanwhile, Mariupol's city council says thousands of Ukrainians have been taken by force across the border to Russia. Fighting is still said to be ongoing in the city after an art school, where around 400 people were taking shelter, was also bombed. There's still no word on casualties, but the city council confirmed that the building was destroyed and there were victims under the rubble. Well, former head of the British Army, General Sir Mike Jackson, has told GB News he can't rule out the possibility of World War III or the use of nuclear arms. He said President Putin's objective is to rebuild the old Soviet Union.
It seems to me the only way that we can bring this dreadful war to an end is for Putin to accept that his original aims are unachievable.
In other news, police have arrested a man on suspicion of murder after the death of a teenager in central London. 22-year-old Maher Marouf was found in the Clerkenwell area following a manhunt. It's believed the Tunisian national had been in a relationship with 19-year-old Sabita Tanwani, who was found with serious neck injuries at her student accommodation yesterday. A woman has been charged with murder after a body was found buried in a back garden in Northampton. The remains are believed to be those of a missing 42-year-old man. Forensic officers and specialist search teams made the discovery during a search of a property. 48-year-old Fiona Beale was arrested at a hotel in Cumbria. She'll appear at Northampton Magistrates Court tomorrow. 6 people were killed and 10 others seriously injured when a car ploughed into a crowd in Belgium. The incident happened in a small village about 30 miles south of the capital, Brussels. Police say the vehicle was driven at high speed into a group of carnival performers who were preparing for a parade. 2 people have been arrested. The incident's not thought to be terror-related. Conservationists believe a huge fire that devastated a nature reserve on the Wirral was deliberately lit. The Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, which manages the reserve, is assessing the damage. Flames quickly spread across marshland at Parkgate yesterday evening, with firefighters extinguishing the blaze shortly before 7 o'clock this morning. Millions of people in England will begin to be offered COVID booster jabs this week. The NHS says the vaccine will be available to care home residents, those over 75, and the immunosuppressed aged 12 and over. 5 million people are expected to be given the jab. The Duke and Duchess of Cambridge will learn about efforts to preserve Belize's barrier reef as they continue their Caribbean tour. William and Kate spent time with the country's Prime Minister on their day 2 of their 8-day trip, marking the Queen's Platinum Jubilee. Their visit hasn't been without controversy. Some residents protested against the royal couple's arrival and helicopter landing site. Archaeologists have uncovered 5 ancient tombs in Egypt's Saqqara necropolis just outside of Cairo. Dating back more than 4,000 years, the tombs belong to top officials from the Old Kingdom and First Immediate period. They were discovered in a cemetery, and some are complete with burial shafts. They also contain well-preserved paintings and artefacts, including small statues and pottery. TV, online and DAB+ radio. This is GB News. We'll have more at the top of the next hour.
Looking ahead to this evening's weather, and the UK is looking dry and clear for many, though it will chill off after sunset. Let's take a look at the details. Firstly, in the far southwest, there'll be some more cloud around here this evening, and perhaps even the odd spot of rain, but that cloud will keep temperatures up. Over to the east, and a clear, calmer end to the weekend, though in any rural areas it will start to feel pretty chilly around dusk. Moving back to the west, and in South Wales, there'll continue to be hardly a cloud in the sky tonight, chilly here as well. Next now to the Midlands, where you can see the odd spot of fog and mist developing this evening, but otherwise a clear and cool end to the day after a sunny-filled weekend. Now moving further east, and there will be more cloud across northeast England this evening, and in coastal areas a chance of some very light rain, though inland it will also be pretty chilly. Whizzing over to Scotland now, chilly here, especially in the breeze, but staying clear and dry for all, with some mistiness developing at low levels. Finally, we go to Northern Ireland, where it has been a little cloudier so far today, and this evening it will remain mostly cloudy, but that does mean it won't feel too cold. By Monday morning, temperatures will have dipped across the UK, so it will be a clear and crisp start to the week, and that is how the weather is shaping up overnight and into tomorrow morning.
Good morning, you're watching GB News and this is The Political Correction. I'm Jenna Davison and today I'm joined by Paul Embry in Norfolk and from Northern Ireland, Arlene Foster. We're here for the next 2 hours to correct politics and put you, the people, back in charge. As you know, this is not about journalists talking to journalists, it's about you telling us what you think. Coming up in the first hour, we take a look at the ongoing situation in Ukraine as we approach a month since Vladimir Putin launched his invasion. We discuss the P&O Ferries saga after the company slashed 800 jobs without warning this week. And Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe returns home to her family after years of detention in Iran. But as always, we want to hear from you today. So to get involved, email us at gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet us at gbnews. This is The Political Correction. This week, Joe Biden declared to reporters that his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin, was a war criminal. The US president elaborated during a press conference, saying Mr. Putin was a murderous dictator, a pure thug who is waging an immoral war against the people of Ukraine. The comments came before a 2-hour conversation between Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping, which, according to Chinese state media, was candid and in-depth. Elsewhere, French President Emmanuel Macron and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz both had conversations with Putin, in which they reportedly urged the Russian leader to introduce a ceasefire and improve the humanitarian situation. So, Paul, I want to come to you first. There seems to be this sort of increased rhetoric here from the US president. But does it look as though there are signs that there could be a diplomatic solution to the invasion?
Well, you would hope so, because at the end of the day, Deanna, diplomacy or annexation, as far as I can see, are the only two ways out of this conflict. And clearly, we don't want annexation of Ukraine, so we have to work towards diplomacy. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't condemn Putin for the invasion in the first place. And on the question of whether or not he's a war criminal, I think plainly he is. If you launch an illegal war of aggression against another country, then in my book that makes you guilty of a war crime. I just have to say also, however, I just think there's a bit of hypocrisy about this whole debate about war criminality. I mean, I've heard in recent days and weeks, for example, Gordon Brown and Tony Blair talk about Putin being held responsible for an act which constitutes a war crime. And the truth is, you know, the West itself doesn't have clean hands on this. We did a very similar thing in 2003 when we launched an illegal invasion of Iraq. That was an unprovoked attack. It turns out that the premise on which the attack was based turned out to be false. And, you know, these same politicians in Britain didn't say, very few of them at least, said after that, well, our leaders are guilty of a war crime and they should be put before the International Criminal Court. So I like consistency on questions like this. I don't like the idea that some people can be condemned for war crimes when other people tend to get away with it. But to go back to the original point, yeah. There needs to be diplomacy. We need to look at a settlement, I think, based on the Minsk Accords, which, as I've argued before, on the one hand respects the sovereignty of Ukraine, but also deals with the very real problems of the Russian-speaking population in the Donbass.
Mm-hmm. So, Arlene, over to you. We've seen now calls kind of from both sides, from the Russians and the Ukrainians, for peace talks to be successful, though clearly with a lot of different opinions on specifically what the agreement should be. Are you confident that there will be some kind of peace agreement?
Well, I think the focus is now turned, hasn't it, both in America and indeed here in the UK, with what our Prime Minister has said this morning to China. And I find that very interesting that we're now focusing on China. Obviously, China abstained in the United Nations in relation to the invasion into Ukraine. And I think there's a concern now that there may be movement there. That is a big worry, and we need to pay attention to that, and I'm sure that our Foreign Office officials are doing that. But it's the plea from our Prime Minister today to say that China shouldn't choose the side of evil. And I think that terminology, evil, is something that we should focus on as well, because at the beginning of all of this, you will remember that people thought Putin would be mad to go into Ukraine, and there's no way he would go into the whole of Ukraine. He may go into the Donbass region on the east of the country, but he wouldn't invade the whole of Ukraine because that simply would be mad. Now we're talking about evilness. So it's all of this moral code that we're now introducing into the discourse around Ukraine, which I find very interesting. But whatever about that, we seen Putin last week. He gave an interview on Wednesday, which he did a lot of ranting and raving in and talking about purifying the Russian forces and hunting out traitors. Then we had the huge rally in Moscow on Friday, dressed up as if he was going to the ski slopes. But in any event, huge rally, an enormous amount of people there, where again he was giving this imperialistic rant around Russia and what he wanted to see for Russia. And I think it's going to be very difficult. Paul's already referred to war crime. How can you, on one hand, engage in diplomacy and then on the other hand say, well, once this is over, you're going to the Hague because you're guilty of war crimes. So diplomacy is a very difficult thing to be involved in, and I know we're going to talk about it throughout the programme. But it is about walking soft or speaking softly, but carrying a big stick. And I think for us here in the West, Putin believed that we were weak. He looked at what had happened in Afghanistan and he decided to move. So that is a lesson for us not to drop our defence again and to make sure that we are strong in terms of our military and that we do have the ability to react when we need to react.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have seen sort of escalation of these attacks. I mean, reports today of from Mariupol with places where refugees have been sort of hiding now being bombed, civilians being bombed. So any claims that it's just military targets, clearly completely untrue there from the Russians. But at what point should we step in if the violence continues, particularly if it gets ever closer to, the Polish border or the Moldovan border, or dare I say it crosses over? At what point should kind of we in the West, we in Britain, at what point should we intervene, Paul?
Well, I think if it came to it and a NATO country were in some way attacked, then I would expect NATO to invoke Article 5, I think it is, which means that all NATO member states come to that country's defence. I have to say, I think that's probably very unlikely that we're going to find ourselves in that territory. Putin surely understands that to do that would result in a very, very serious backlash militarily and politically and economically and in all sorts of ways. Beyond that, Deanna, I don't necessarily think we can intervene in any military fashion, short of doing what I think we're doing at the moment, which is trying to arm the Ukrainian resistance and to give them weapons. The reality is, and this is where Realpolitik, as it's called, comes into it, Russia is a nuclear power. And I think the last thing we ought to be doing is getting involved in military action against somebody who's got nuclear weapons. And particularly when, as many people have pointed out at the moment, what is Putin's state of mind? In my view, I don't think he is acting rationally. There's possibly no limit to what he might do in those circumstances. So we need to. I think we probably do need to tone down the rhetoric and the bellicosity, and we need a diplomatic way out of it, which, as I say, safeguards Ukraine's sovereign territory, but also delivers on some of the real security concerns that Russian people have in that region.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's focus on this point around the Russian people, because, Putin's attending these rallies, and yet we are seeing increasing protests taking place in Russia, be that on news channels or actual protests out on the street. And I think one thing that I find really fascinating is the actual impact of sanctions on everyday Russian citizens who perhaps don't support the war or perhaps, don't take that much of an interest in current affairs to really know either way. Arlene, have we seen much about how these sanctions play out for your sort of everyday Russian citizen?
Well, I think that's always the key. And Paul and I and you have talked about this in the past, that it's actually ordinary families and ordinary people in Russia who will be hit by the sanctions. I'm not sure that if you had an 18-year-old son being sent off to war in Ukraine, you would have been very supportive of the war in any event. But certainly when you're having difficulty going to the shops and having your basic food supply there, that's certainly going to make you think about what your leader is involved in. And it's interesting, I think, Diana, that our own government has involved itself in trying to counter some of the disinformation in Russia with a government information cell set up to counter the sort of disinformation that Russia is putting out there. They're trying to counter that, to tackle it, put out the truth of what's going on in Russia. They're paying for advertisements right across Russia, not just relying on social media. So I think it's interesting that our own government is saying that they want to influence ordinary Russians in a way to say to them, this is what your leader is doing, it is wrong, and therefore you should react in the appropriate way.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about disinformation, but in a sort of UK context, because what we've seen happen this week is the media regulator Ofcom revoking Russia Today's licence to broadcast in the UK with immediate effect. Russia Today, which is a state-backed news channel, has been under investigation by Ofcom for their coverage of Vladimir Putin's ongoing invasion of Ukraine. The channel became unavailable on all UK broadcast platforms earlier this month as a result of a ban imposed by the European Union. Culture Secretary Nadine Dorries described the channel as Putin's polluting propaganda machine. So, Arlene, clearly this is a decision taken by Ofcom, which is an independent body, independent of kind of government. But do you think it's the right decision from Ofcom to ban RT, or do you think that goes too far with regards to free speech?
Well, I think it's about proportionality, and I actually think that it's not proportionate, because very few people believe that Russia Today was a basis of getting impartial information around Ukraine. So I think most people regarded it as Putin's propaganda machine, and they could see how ridiculous some of his claims were when they listened to it. So I don't think it's proportionate action, because, of course, we should always try and defend free speech. And because of that, it's one of the fundamentals of democracy. We need to look at whether it's proportionate to suspend or to stop someone from broadcasting. And therefore, whilst I'm no lover of Russia today, I can assure you of that, I do think that it is disproportionate at this time.
And Paul, what's your take?
I tend to agree. I would say, why only now is it that Ofcom have suddenly decided to close down RT when it's been going for years? It strikes me as opportunism. It strikes me that Ofcom is caving into people who are demanding that RT be shut down. And look, I mean, I tend to take a similar view to Arlene. I mean, I'd like to think I'm grown up enough to pick through what I consider to be propaganda on RT and what I consider to be more balanced reporting. And I'd like to think that most people in this country would consider themselves grown up enough to do that as well. And I think they probably are. And I'm just uncomfortable about living in a society that just simply shuts down television news channels, because palpably in this case, because it wasn't giving out the right message as the authorities saw it. And I have to say, I mean, I don't think you need to be pro-Putin to take that view. I've seen all sorts of commentators express unease about it. John Simpson, for example, that doyen of foreign reporting for the BBC over the years, himself has expressed real concern about it. So in my book, it allows people to say, well, you're no different to Putin. You're just shutting down alternative media outlets. You're just shutting down views that you don't like. I would have liked to see RT continue and people, where necessary, to continue challenging it. That's what I think a democratic grown-up society should do.
I suppose the sort of broader question is, where do we draw that fine line between kind of propaganda and pure disinformation? And I guess this is what Ofcom were looking at with regards to the RT reporting. Arlene, do you think that we should just allow kind of any kind of broadcasts along this vein, or do you think it is right that Ofcom step in when something is, complete disinformation and completely false?
Well, I mean, that's the reason Ofcom's there. Ofcom's there to be a regulator. Ofcom is there to call out broadcasters when they're putting out things which palpably aren't true, and they could have continued to do that. And if RT had said, no, we're going to continue to put out the disinformation and lies, then Ofcom could have taken proportionate action. But I think if you ban something like RT, then people start to question whether actually they were telling the truth, and is that the reason why they're being put underground? The conspiracy theories then begin to roll out. And I don't think there was a need for that, because anybody watching RT would have known where they were coming from, and the disinformation and lies that they were putting out was quite clear for everybody to see. So I just worry that some people will now say, well, clearly government felt threat by that, they have got rid of it, and therefore the conspiracy theories will now start to run.
And Paul, is there a danger now that it actually drives the sort of RT-style messaging kind of underground, more online in places that are harder to regulate?
Well, I mean, I agree with Arlene on the conspiracy point. I think when you try to ban people who are peddling things that you consider to be untrue, that you consider to be damaging, it allows those people to say, hey, look what they've done to me. Why do you think they've done that? Because I was telling the truth and they didn't like it, which is exactly what conspiracy theorists themselves do. So it certainly does allow now people to say, well, hold on a second, was RT onto something? Were they giving us information that other mainstream news channels in Britain weren't giving us? So it plays into all of that kind of mindset. And that itself, I think, is reason enough not to ban a TV station. But look, if television stations put out stuff that's palpably untrue, I think we've got the type of society, the type of open society here that can challenge that and can say, look, this was clearly untrue, and these are the reasons why. And if that happens, let us do that. I think the sledgehammer approach of saying, let's just clamp down on them by shutting them down and cutting off their oxygen supply and stopping them from speaking entirely, has always got the tendency to backfire. And I suspect, by the way, that people at RT and people in Moscow will be rubbing their hands together and saying, this has played into our hands, actually.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
Make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel.
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
That you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before. It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back to The Political Correction. UK government has officially launched its Homes for Ukraine scheme, which will see families across the country host Ukrainians who fled their homeland following Russia's invasion. Secretary of State for Levelling Up Michael Gove said of the scheme that the United Kingdom has a long and proud history of helping others in their hour of need, adding that the scheme offers a lifeline to those who've been forced to flee. Politicians who've expressed an interest in hosting refugees include Transport Secretary Grant Shapps and Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer. So, Paul, I'm going to throw to you first on this one. Clearly, this is an act of international altruism. But do you think there is an element of political grandstanding from MPs here and kind of pressure on them to host displaced families?
I think there is. It seems to me, I mean, first of all, look, if someone volunteers to take in a refugee fleeing war, good on them. You know, they've got my support. I pay tribute to them. But politically, I do think there is a little bit of virtue signalling going on. It's almost become a little bit like the new, look at me, I'm taking a picture of myself wearing a mask on an empty train, aren't I a good person type of thing. And I think we need to avoid that, actually. I don't think we need to make it the subject of political point scoring in that way. I think a bigger point that I would make, actually, is the whole question of international refugees and why suddenly there has been a very different approach to the Ukraine situation to the approach we take in other wars which are raging around the world at the moment. Now, you know, as I say, I pay tribute to anyone who takes in a Ukrainian refugee. And of course, we've got a history in this country of providing shelter to people war, and that's a proud history, and it's one that we should look to continue with. But I'm uncomfortable, to be honest, Deanna, about what I'm seeing as a little bit of a hierarchy of victimhood. There have been thousands and thousands of Kurdish refugees displaced over recent years. Nobody in Britain seems to be paying much attention to them or offering to take them into their homes. At the moment, there's a war raging in the Yemen, led by Saudi Arabia, our ally, ironically. And again, thousands of Yemeni people have been displaced, men, women and children. And there doesn't seem to be any scheme to give support or succour to those refugees. So I understand that this war is taking place in Europe. But at the end of the day, it doesn't mean that people are suffering any more than they are in those other wars. And I would like to see a little bit of consistency on this. I think, you know, we need to look at the big picture and understand that there are refugees all across the world, and perhaps they all deserve our support.
Yeah, and this is something that we've discussed a few times on the show now, Paul, isn't it, since the sort of crisis in Ukraine kicked off. Arlene, I want to come back to this point around kind of politicians and hosting refugees, because you'll know from your time as First Minister, you do get asked these questions. You will always get asked, you know, in this circumstance, will you personally host a family? I've been asked it by a whole host of different media outlets, as though it's just a sort of snap decision. But actually, I think there are things that aren't taken into account, aren't there? Such as, one, security, two, actually being able to provide that dedicated support, especially, you know, sort of when you're a Westminster politician, when you're up and down from your constituency and away for at least half the week. But also, something that doesn't really get mentioned, that media support as well. Because if a high-profile politician takes in a family, then is that family not at risk of media scrutiny or, you know, potentially even being hounded by media when what they're just trying to do is resettle?
Yeah, and I can understand why politicians would want to look as if they are doing their bit for refugees coming in from Ukraine. I absolutely understand that. And for those who have stepped forward, I'm sure they have thought about it a lot. I know that Grant Shapps said that he had discussed it very much with his family, and you would like to think that they recognise the challenges, not just for their own family and bringing a family from Ukraine into that family, but also the fact, as you've rightly said, that Ukrainian family have been forced to leave their home. They've been displaced. They will be distressed. They will need support, not just in terms of food and access to services, but also emotional support as well as to how they deal with what has been going on. And if you are a member of Parliament and you live on your own, you certainly will not have the time to provide that support that those people will need. And you're right to draw attention to the security element and also the media element, because you know very well, Diana, if you were to take someone into your home in Bishop Auckland, first thing that would happen is that the local newspaper would land. They would want photographs with you and your Ukrainian family. And then that pushes that family into the spotlight, whether they want to be in the spotlight or not, despite the fact that these are people in distress, people who have been forced from their home. And actually, what they probably want is anonymity and a bit of peace and quiet. So it looks as if politicians are doing the right thing, but really, you really have to think about, are you doing good for the people that you're hoping to bring into your home by bringing them into a high-profile person's home? And I think people should really think about that.
Yeah, I think it's some of these nuances that often kind of don't get discussed, you know, when the blanket question is asked. And we've seen a number of politicians who've, you know, come out and said that they would be happy to host a family and have registered for the scheme. I think there are 8 or 9 now who've kind of publicly declared. But I think it's really important, as you said, Arlene, to take into account personal circumstances. You know, so for example, were I to take in a family in my Bishop Auckland home, it'd be really difficult because I'm away 4 or 5 days a week. The place in which I live, it's difficult to access with buses, which means they'd need a car to get around. They might not necessarily drive. And also just knowing where to go to get that support. You talked about emotional support, but even things like knowing where the local GP surgery is, knowing where the local supermarket is. You need someone there with you, certainly in those first few sensitive weeks until a refugee family is settled, to really support them and in a way kind of hold their hand through it until they feel kind of up to sort of tackling it themselves. And so I think we need to just be a little bit careful about the narrative here of, you know, our politicians aren't bothering to use their second homes for Ukrainian families, when actually there's a lot more nuance to it than that, isn't there, Paul?
Yeah, and I have to say, I mean, you know, you gave an explanation of your personal situation there, Deanna. I don't think anyone should be compelled to feel they have to give an explanation, MP or otherwise. As we've said, people have all manner of different personal circumstances which will determine whether or not they're able to accommodate a refugee. And if they conclude that they can, great. If they conclude that it wouldn't be practical, then they're perfectly entitled to come to that judgment without any condemnation. It is as far as I'm concerned, a very, very personal decision to be taken by individuals and their families, and it's as simple as that.
Mm-hmm. Well, send us your views. If you're watching, have you registered with the scheme? Are you going to be taking in a Ukrainian family? Send us your thoughts on gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet us at gbnews. Now, this week, Prime Minister Boris Johnson headed to Saudi Arabia in a bid to secure more bilateral trade with the nation, following a halt in Russian oil imports after Putin's invasion of Ukraine at the start of last month. The EU, Washington and London plan to back the Russian leader into a corner with their continuing sanctions and economic pressures. But where one door shuts, another must open, surely. Arlene, over to you on this. Do you think this trip is a sign of continuing global uncertainty on energy production because of the ongoing war in Ukraine, or do you think it's deeper than that about the UK and Saudi's kind of ongoing relationship?
Well, Saudi Arabia, and Paul referenced this earlier, is one of our, in quotes, allies. I'm reminded of Lord Palmerston when he said there's no such things as eternal allies or permanent enemies. There's just one thing, and that's interests, and interests will always be eternal. And I mean, that's the reality. The Prime Minister has been confronted with what's happening in Ukraine. He has been advised that he therefore needs to look at his energy supply. I would argue, of course, that he should have been doing that a long time ago, and we should have been looking to our energy supply within the UK as a whole. In any event, he now has to look at where we get our energy from, and he's decided to speak to the Middle East. And the Middle East have for a long time UAE, Oman, Bahrain, all of these places have been allies, and we may or may not like it, but that is the reality. And we know that there are horrific things happening in some of those places. When the PM is confronted with that, he says, oh yes, I have raised that issue. I've spoken to the leaders about the fact that there are human rights abuses. But his primary objective, and this may be difficult for some people to hear, his primary objective is not what's happening in that country, but actually what's happening in our own country and how he can protect our citizens and make sure that we have access to energy supplies.
Mm. And Paul, isn't there an argument that actually having an ongoing relationship and an ongoing dialogue with nations like Saudi Arabia actually allows us face-to-face to discuss some of these human rights abuses?
Well, that's the argument, isn't it? But you could equally say, well, that should be the argument for why we should engage with Putin, why we should engage with China. It just seems to me that this is just another example of the hypocrisy of Western foreign policy, which has been, going on now for decades and decades. And the irony that we don't want to become over-reliant on one particular foreign dictator who has attacked another country in terms of our energy supply reliance. So therefore, we're going cap in hand to Saudi Arabia, another tyrannical country, which is also prosecuting a war against a neighbouring country, Yemen, and which itself has a terrible human rights record. And, I just don't think that no amount of talk about realpolitik can get you out of an accusation of hypocrisy on that one, because it very clearly is hypocrisy. But it's nothing new, let's be honest. I mean, if you look at the history of the West, I mean, Turkey, for example, with a pretty poor human rights record, clamps down on free speech, is a NATO member. We backed Saddam Hussein before he invaded Kuwait in the war with Iran. We were on his side. The US will intervene in Latin American countries politically and economically if it doesn't like the particular government of the day. So as I say, it's just hypocrisy, and it should be called out.
Thanks, Paul. Well, again, send us your thoughts, gbviews@gbnews.uk. Now, coming up after the break, we're discussing the P&O Ferries saga, in which 800 employees lost their jobs on the spot. Stay with us.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
Basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
P&O Ferries is facing outrage this week after firing 800 crew members on the spot without warning and leaving travellers stranded. In a pre-recorded video, staff were informed they were losing their jobs with immediate effect to be replaced by cheaper agency workers. Protests were sparked across various ports in the UK, with the RMT union describing the move as one of the most shameful acts in the history of British industrial relations. Before we open the discussion, let's have a listen to what Transport Secretary Grant Shapps had to say to our very own GB News political correspondent, Tom Harwood.
We understand that companies have to make money, otherwise they can't be in business. I mean, no problem with companies making a profit. And we understand that they may have to make changes. You do not treat your staff in that way. Pre-recorded, 30 minutes notice on a Zoom to tell you you've lost your job, in many cases of decades. People who've been working for P&O Ferries.
So, Paul, as our sort of resident trade union expert here on GB News, I want to throw to you first. What have you made of this whole development?
Well, I mean, as you say, Deanna, I'm a trade unionist to my core, but I don't think you have to be a trade unionist particularly to understand what's going on here and how wrong it is. I mean, what has happened to those hundreds of workers at P&O is, in my view, absolutely despicable. And what we're seeing is something that's no better than gangster capitalism. These were, many of these people, as Grant Shapps said, had worked for a long time for the company, had given dedicated service over many years to that company. And to be told in a video call the day before that you're going to effectively be sacked and replaced with cheaper agency labour. I mean, I have to say, as someone with some basic knowledge of employment law, it strikes me, first of all, that is completely in breach of employment law. But just as a moral point of view, the idea that you should do that to people, especially P&O, a so-called reputable company that's well known, I think is absolutely despicable. And I think this dispute now has got the potential to go to the heart of a debate about how much we value our workers, what employment legislation we're prepared to enact in order to defend our workers from these sorts of unscrupulous bosses, and what we're prepared to do about it. And I'm really glad to see that the trade union movement at large has come to the defence of these workers, and I hope that spreads, and I hope ordinary people take part in the process as well. Because, I mean, it doesn't seem to me that this company was on the brink of liquidation or on the brink of going out of business. I understand sometimes if a company is failing, it may have to take drastic measures, but even then you still consult with the workforce before doing that. This was a company that claimed £10 million in furlough during the pandemic. This is a company that's just handed £270 million to its shareholders. There is absolutely nothing defensible, in my view, in the actions of P&O. And I would like to see the government go even further and potentially suspend any government contracts that it's got, which I believe it has, because it needs, in my view, the most robust response to something like this, which has got no place in a modern workplace or in a modern economy or society.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the things that I'm probably a little bit concerned about coming out of this is that there might be renewed calls for a legislative ban on kind of so-called fire and rehire tactics, which is something that Parliament's already discussed. And you touched on it there, Paul, this point around sometimes in order to survive and not go under, businesses do have to restructure. I think clearly we can all agree that in P&O's case, that doesn't seem to have been the case whatsoever. But Paul, I'll just come to you briefly on this. Do you think that it is right that there should be a legislative ban on that? Or do you think we need to somehow toe a middle ground to make sure that businesses who are struggling do have that flexibility, particularly as if the business goes under, all those jobs are lost anyway, aren't they?
I think the problem is, Deanna, that it's not just businesses that are about to go under that are using these fire and hire tactics. I mean, I have to say, I've been in the public sector. I've been a victim of fire and rehire back in 2010, when, in my view, there was absolutely no business case for it at all. And I and thousands of my colleagues were threatened with the sack, effectively, unless we decided to come back on the new contracts that had been presented to us. And it seems to me to be a charter for unscrupulous employers, when it suits them, just to attack the pay and conditions of ordinary workers. And if you sign a contract of employment, in my view, you're entitled to expect that contract to be honoured. And as I said before, I accept we live in a market economy. I accept that there are times when businesses may fail. And of course, it's right and proper that we have robust redundancy measures in place for when that happens. But the number of employers who seem to be taking advantage of their ability to be able to fire and rehire in this way, for me, is completely wrong. And yes, I do support the legislative ban, and I think Parliament should enact it as quickly as possible.
Well, I can understand where Paul's coming from in relation to the workers, and of course it was completely outrageous. P&O Ferries actually own Larne Harbour, and they have an issue there, and we have an issue here then in relation to our supply chain, because around 50% of our food goods come from GB. And we're told that P&O won't be running between GB and Northern Ireland now for 2 weeks. Of course, is of grave concern for us here in relation to our supply issues. But secondly, the firm that owns P&O Ferries are, I understand, DP World. They're a Dubai-based organisation. And that's the organisation that have been involved in a lot of the free ports that have been designated around the UK. So that is of concern as well, because if this company thinks it's acceptable to treat their employees in the way that they have treated them, sacking them over Zoom, no consultation, just paying their way out of this situation, despite the fact, as Paul has said, they paid £270 million of a dividend in 2019. I think then that should be a matter of concern for the government as well in relation to structural issues moving forward, Deanna.
I think it's one of these that Grant Shapps and the rest of the transport team are going to be taking incredibly seriously moving forward, so watch this space. Now, on the political correction, we explore the work done by our members of Parliament, what they get up to on the ground and in Westminster to serve us as legislators and to serve the constituents who elect them. Now, this week, I am delighted to be joined by the Labour MP for Ealing Central and Acton, Dr Rupa Hook, to hear about her work in Parliament and her West London constituency. Rupa, thank you for joining us on the show this morning. So my first question...
Thanks for having me, Dan.
Not at all. My first question is a little bit about your overall experience as an MP, because you're elected back in 2015. And I guess we can say it's been a pretty tumultuous period since then, with Brexit raging, with COVID, and now with the war in Ukraine. So my question is, what in your mind has been the sort of highest high of the job since then, and what's been the lowest low?
Do you know, it has been a topsy-turvy time. And in reality, I would only be just ending my first term, I guess, or, just starting the second. I've had 3, because we've had an election every other year, 3 times in that period, despite the Fixed Term Parliaments Act. So I think some of the individual highs are helping individual people, to be honest. So I think in my first year, I do a weekly, in fact, it's restarted again. For COVID, it stopped, and then for Omicron, restarted in September last year, then it stopped for Omicron. So I do an advice surgery 2 hours every Friday. And I remember very early on, someone came in and they were a third-year PhD student from Syria. And because there was an asset freeze, that there were no money allowed to come in and out of Damascus, their third-year fees that they thought were paid by a scholarship to UCL, where they were doing their PhD here, hadn't come, and they were about to be chucked off their course and kicked out of the country. And everything they'd tried was drawing a blank. So I said to UCL, I'm going to raise this on the floor of the House. So it's an amazing honour and privilege, you know this, Hannah, that you're able to do that. And they weren't listening to her, so I did this. And in business questions, in fact, And then very quickly, UCL relented. They said that they've waived the fees because she had other friends in other universities where they'd done this. So she was able to continue. She was saved from a war zone. So, I mean, that's my first early high, I remember. And there've been bits and pieces like that along the way. Lowest low, probably the 2019 election when we went down to our lowest number of seats since 1935. Although it brought you in, which is, you know, on balance, nice to have more funky young people around. It looked really serious for the Labour Party, and it looked like we were on the brink of extinction for a minute.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. Everyone that we speak to for this segment, always, whenever we ask what the highs are, it's always one of those personal stories and about how you've been able to help an individual. And I think that says so much about the way in which we do this job, doesn't it? I mean, people think it's about the theatricality and what you kind of see in PMQs and in the chamber, but actually, so much of the job isn't like that at all, is it?
Yeah, big time. I mean, the one I did on Friday, I had a sixth form student helping out, and she said, I had no idea you guys do this. It was very humbling to see. And again, we had a wide range of cases. There was someone who'd got out of Ukraine. I'm thinking of raising this one in the House. But they haven't finished their medical degree, so they want to transfer credits, and they were 90% there. There was an Afghanistan case, you know, all sorts, the usual housing repairs. People show you horrendous pictures of their ceiling falling in on their phone or whatever. So, yeah, I mean, a lot of it is seriously unglam. People just know PMQs, which is, 40 minutes on a Wednesday. That's a tiny chunk of our lives. I mean, I'm off canvassing at 11 in a second. So it's a 7 days a week, full-on job. And people just don't know the whole extent of it. They just think lazy fat cats, pay rises, blah, blah, blah. It's not like that.
Oh, yeah, we get that accusation quite a lot. I want to touch on that point about PMQs. I think people seem to think that often it's difficult for MPs of one party or one colour rosette to kind of get along with MPs from other parties. But that's so not the case, is it? There is so much cross-party work that goes on. And I saw your column with Matt Hancock actually recently about how we need more compassion in politics. It was fantastic. And just talk to us about cross-party working, about how important it is.
Yeah, I mean, actually, the Matt Hancock column came out of, I did the closing eulogy in the David Amos tributes. And my last line was, we all need to be a bit more David. We should all be a bit less cross and more cross-party. And, you know, we all want the same thing for our constituents, which is, you know, the best for our local area, that kind of thing. But as you say, people just see the Yarbu oppositional thuggery of PMQs. And behind the scenes, we have a lot of APPGs, all-party parliamentary groups. And you do, especially with a Conservative majority of 80, you do have to work with other parties. I think one of my colleagues who's no longer there said in 2017, she's never going to talk to a Tory. I mean, that's just bonkers. They've been in power for 12 years. You can't get along with not talking to another Tory. So, yeah, a lot of alliances are forged. And Matt Hancock came up to me after that thing and said, that was really good. Let's make something happen out of this. So actually, Dehenna, you could be involved too. I'll talk to you tomorrow about this at length.
Brilliant.
We're doing an edited collection of essays by MPs from different parties about more compassion in politics, more understanding. You know, we're all human beings. But there is, even the very nature of the building, the fact that you're in a face-off with the other side, breeds this oppositional culture. The whole thing of PMQs is to shout down the other lot as loud as you can. And it's just not a sensible way for mature decision-making in a democracy.
No, I completely agree with you. And as for the essay collection, yeah, we'll have a chat, and you may have found a new recruit here here today.
Good.
I kind of want to talk about your point there about kind of having to work with the government, the Conservative government, because, you know, we are there. But also, how does that contrast with working alongside devolved body in London on things like transport? How do you kind of manage the two?
Yeah, no, good point. Because a lot of times when I ask about transport sort of things, they say, oh, it's all your Labour mayor's fault. I mean, there's different levels of government, and central government funds the Mayor of London, so it's complicated. But look, I would say that throughout both COVID and the Ukraine crisis, there's been unanimity on a lot of stuff. And again, I get Labour Party members saying, when are the gloves going to come off? When are you going to start attacking them more? But for a moment of national crisis, like a war on mainland Europe, you know, it's not the time for party politics and bickering. And, people want to see their government succeed in a pandemic as well. So, there's a time and a place for everything. But you're right about the devolved bodies. We see it as well with the SNP, don't we? That I think we're both united in this one, Hannah, as unionist parties. We think we're stronger together. As a London MP, it does feel extremely frustrating that if you ask any question, a minister will say, oh, it's all Sadiq Khan's fault, whereas actually, things like London Transport, to be fair, there used to always be a central government grant for that. And then it stopped in 2016 under George Osborne. And I do feel that's a little bit mean because we've got a Labour mayor now. I think, we need sustainable long-term solutions. It shouldn't just be election to election, oh, who's in power now? Let's be a bit nasty and cut the funding. I mean, London Transport is surviving, but it seems that we have these very hand-to-mouth settlements. There's always an 11th hour sort of negotiation, and then the buses do continue to run. But I mean, again, their fares have been down massively. They're very fare reliant because they don't have a huge central government grant. And with COVID, people haven't been travelling. So, yeah, it's complicated, as Facebook would say.
Absolutely. And I want to talk about some of your actual campaigns that you've run. There's one that really sort of grasped my imagination that I know you and I discussed, and that was around banning protest outside abortion clinics. And you had a private members bill on that. Tell us about how that went.
Yeah, actually, that's another proud moment as well, because we had a massive majority. I think you were on side as well, Dehenna. Most people were. I think only 30 people. We did have 650 MPs voted against it. So this is nothing to do with abortion and the number of weeks and that, but it is legal in this country, has been since 1968. So women who want to avail themselves of abortion clinics find that they're not able to get in the door of these buildings. And it's an unusual one because in this country, it's done in standalone clinics a lot. I think in Scotland, the SNP, I couldn't get on board with this campaign because they said it's in hospitals, it's entirely separate. It's not, people don't get targeted in the same way. So what you have in England and Wales is standalone abortion clinics. And so women using those services, it's very clear what they're there for. So they face a barrage of protesters. At the moment, I think in the run-up to Lent, there's a group called 40 Days for Life that are doing a 40-day running protest at dozens of clinics around the country. Yeah, and the whole idea of that is just to shame women about their personal choices. It's legal. They should be allowed to access healthcare in anonymity like you would with anything else, with any other operation. So what has happened actually in my local authority in Ealing is that they made, because there'd been a 25-year protest, it had been going on for ages at the clinic we have. So they'd made a bylaw, local authority bylaw, where there's a 150-metre radius around the clinic. So you can protest at the edges of it, but just not at the clinic gates.
Looking ahead to this evening's weather, and the UK is looking dry and clear for many, though it will chill off after sunset. Let's take a look at the details. Firstly, in the far southwest, there'll be some more cloud around here this evening, and perhaps even the odd spot of rain, but that cloud will keep temperatures up. Over to the east, and a clear, calmer end to the weekend, though in any rural areas it will start to feel pretty chilly around dusk. Moving back to the west, and in South Wales, there'll continue to be hardly a cloud in the sky tonight, chilly here as well. Next now to the Midlands, where you can see the odd spot of fog and mist developing this evening, but otherwise a clear and cool end to the day after a sunny-filled weekend. Now moving further east, and there will be more cloud across northeast England this evening, and in coastal areas a chance of some very light rain, though inland it will also be pretty chilly. Whizzing over to Scotland now, chilly here, especially in the breeze, but staying clear and dry for all, with some mistiness developing at low levels. Finally, we go to Northern Ireland, where it has been a little cloudier so far today, and this evening it will remain mostly cloudy, but that does mean it won't feel too cold. By Monday morning, temperatures will have dipped across the UK, so it will be a clear and crisp start to the week, and that is how the weather is shaping up overnight and into tomorrow morning.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate.
From all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
Make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel.
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
That you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News